Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Threadbare Reviews. We finally got a book request in this series, and it's all thanks to patron A Great Divorce, asking me to cover an old novella called The Great God Pan. The book was first published in 1894 by author Arthur Machen. About the author. Arthur Machen, whose real name was Arthur Llewellyn Jones Machen, was born in 1863 in Monmouthshire, the southeastern part of Wales. Jones was his father's last name and Machen was his mother's, and the two had apparently combined their names as a condition for getting a Machen family inheritance. Arthur would go on to use Jones for most purposes in his life, but used his mother's maiden name when he wrote fiction. This was, after all, a time when you didn't admit to being a genre fiction author in polite company. Like a lot of fantasy authors, Machen was fascinated by the pastoral landscape he grew up in, along with old myths and adventure stories like Arabian Nights and Don Quixote. He got a parochial education thanks to his father being a minister, and his family couldn't afford to send him to a university, so instead he went to London and worked several jobs to make ends meet as he wrote poems and stories in his spare time. He eventually got a publisher's attention in 1884, and that led him to become a translator of French works. He also got married to a music teacher who introduced him to literary and occultist figures like Arthur Waite, the co-creator of the classic Rider-Waite tarot deck. In the 1890s, Machen started to achieve some real success. In the first year of that decade, he published the first part of The Great God Pan as a standalone short story. The next year, he published the second chapter, and later that same year, he created a larger story that linked the two narratives together. It would take a few years more for him to find a publisher, but once he did, it became his breakout success. His next novel, The Three Impostors, came out the next year in 1895, but he had trouble getting published for several years after that. 1895 was the year Oscar Wilde was arrested for sodomy, and during the trial there was a lot of publicity surrounding the seedy homosexual underworld of London. Decadent and vaguely sexual fiction like the sort Machen wrote became deeply unpopular for several years, and so the novels he wrote at the time would only get published much later. Machen has said that the inspiration for The Great God Pan came from visiting old Roman ruins in southern Wales, and in particular a ruined Romano-Celtic temple dedicated to Nodens, a god of hunting in wild spaces. It was written in the Gothic horror tradition, and has aspects of both science fiction and fantasy, which weren't clearly defined genres at that point. Something else the book did was imply that men and women have sex with each other outside of marriage. And even though bad things happened to both parties as a result of this, it caused a great big scandal and a lot of savage reviews by literary critics. Of course, for his part, Oscar Wilde called it a strong success. Still, the work was popular among certain crowds, and the story would be reevaluated in 1920 when society had loosened up a bit. It would also inspire a lot of the horror stories that followed it, such as Bram Stoker's Dracula, H.P. Lovecraft's The Dunwich Horror, and Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth. Well, that's enough about the story's legacy. The review. A man named Clark visits a friend of his named Dr. Raymond, performs a surgery on an orphan girl named Mary. The goal of the surgery is to open her eyes to the spiritual world beyond the mortal realm. And while the operation is successful, Mary rapidly descends into madness thanks to the horrors of the invisible world. Years later, Clark hears about an even younger girl named Helen Vaughan, who went to live with a foster family in a small town, but who spent most of her time in the woods and seemed to be connected to terrible visions and frightening events experienced by the children around her. Several more years pass, and a man named Villers happens across an old friend named Herbert, who has since become homeless. Herbert explains that he married a woman who corrupted him, body and soul, and soon afterwards he turns up dead. Villers discusses the event with Clark, and after investigating some, he discovers that Herbert's house was known for strange noises at night, and there was a man who died of fright on the property a few years back. When he discovers a sketch of Herbert's wife, Clark identifies her as Helen. She then resurfaces a third time, now under the alias Mrs. Beaumont, and Clark discovers that a string of wealthy men have inexplicably committed suicide after spending a night with Beaumont. Clark and Villers confront Helen about her actions, and they give her a noose, telling her to use it or else they'll expose her identity. She does so, and after dying, her body transforms several times between male and female, human and beast, and finally from a goo to an image of the god Pan. Because when Mary saw beyond reality, she was impregnated by one of the things she saw, and her daughter Helen was also the daughter of the great god Pan. The structure of the novella was somewhat hard for me to follow. Maybe it's because it started out as 2 independent short stories, but the structure was disjointed and the narrative kept switching between different protagonists experiencing different stories that only really tied themselves together at the very end. By that point, we've moved through several sets of characters, and because a lot of them are stuffy white Londoners, I had trouble telling them apart. It also switched several times between a regular third-person narrative and an epistolary format, which is where a story is told through a series of diary entries and other documents. Dracula is another epistolary book, and I'd say it's a much more effective example of the format. It's not just about Dracula either. The Great God Pan seems to me to be one of those works that has diminished because of the strength of its successors. The Dunwich Horror takes the terrible offspring aspect of the story and cranks it all the way up to the top. Pan's Labyrinth creates some very haunting visuals that the short descriptions in the novella can't match. Works about sex, seduction, and temptation in general are much more overt about their topics today, and so the quiet implications made by this book are so tame by comparison that it's hard to even notice them. All in all, I don't think I'd recommend reading The Great God Pan. Instead, read one of the many works that the novella inspired. Still, it does have some value if you're interested in the roots of the cosmic horror genre. Plus, it's a quick read, and it's free to download from Project Gutenberg. Just don't expect anything too mind-blowing by today's standards. The analysis. Terror is an interesting word. It's the root of 3 very different adjectives: terrifying, terrible, and terrific. I bring this up because apparently Machen's goal with the Great God Pan was to share the emotions he felt when walking alone through the forests and ancient ruins of southern Wales. He would go on to say that he failed at this goal, or at best only created an incomplete picture, and overall, I'd have to agree with him. As I said earlier, the Great God Pan is an early example of cosmic horror, or you might say it's a grandfather of the genre. The central theme of cosmic horror is fear of the unknown, fear of spaces where humans shouldn't go, shouldn't try to understand, because the path inevitably leads to madness and death. Dr. Raymond opened the door to the unknown, and what slipped through caused many men to go insane, and even more men to take their own lives. It clearly wasn't something that belonged in our tiny piece of reality. So that's the bit that's terrifying, and the part that's terrible, but what about the third aspect of terror? There are bits and pieces that imply that terror is also terrific. Mostly it comes from the descriptions Machen writes about the wild spaces that some of the characters visit, or just stare at in wonder. And you also see it in the frantic enthusiasm Dr. Raymond has for his work before he operates on Mary. Then there's the fact that Clark, an otherwise ordinary Londoner, is a collector of strange stories that he calls memoirs to prove the existence of the devil. He fully believes in science and reason, but in his heart, he hopes that he can prove the existence of something more, something like magic or the supernatural. And he finds it. He finds it, and he doesn't go mad or kill himself. Neither does Dr. Raymond, for that matter. But even so, all of that isn't enough to counterbalance the clear warning we get from the nature of the story and the corrupting, destructive influence that Helen has on all the people who get too close to her. She comes from a place where humans dare not tread, and the only way we can protect ourselves is by destroying her and never speaking of her again. To me, that doesn't sound like a healthy attitude to take, and by the sound of things, the author would agree with me. It's just a shame he didn't manage to put the whole message in his story. Thanks for joining me again for today's Threadbare review, and I hope I'll see you next time. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you have a little extra money to spare, you can support me on Patreon. Link in the description.